week 3 video for my online class. So without further ado, let's jump into research methods. I'll be doing a review from week 2. Then I'll provide an overview of some important key terms from the chapter from our textbook on research methods. And then I'll jump into real life research, so my own personal research that I've done in the past. So you can sort of see what a messy real life research project looks like. All right, so again, we'll do housekeeping, week 2 review, chapter 2 overview, lecture, exit paths, and reminders. As we start to round out that time in the semester, that is the beginning of the semester, my expectation is that everyone has asked all the questions that they need to about the syllabus, the course schedule, assignments, and our eLearn page. But I've been getting some feedback from folks in the exit pass that there are varying levels of online technology knowledge. So if you are not very used to technology and you struggle with that, you need to email me and or attend my office hours. I have virtual office hours, which are listed on my syllabus. So make sure you're getting that one-on-one individual help at this point if you don't know how to access the assignments and important documents that you need to in order to be successful in our class. This week, week 3, you should be completing chapter 2 quiz, which focuses primarily on stuff from the textbook. And then discussion 3. Both of these items are due at Sunday at 11:59 p.m. and I'll go over the course schedule one more time in just a second. I will also be posting the midterm study guide on our eLearn page by Wednesday this week, week 3, Wednesday morning at the latest, so that you have over a week to fill that out and prepare and study for our midterm, which is due week 4 on Sunday at 11:59 p.m. And again, review the syllabus for details regarding how much time you have and how many questions you'll be expected to answer for both quizzes and exams. And then if you ever have anything you'd like to share with your classmates, maybe you are really excited about something happening on campus or happening in the broader Dayton community, you can always tell me that in the exit pass or through email, and then I will distribute that information to your classmates. So I hope that helps us foster a sense of community, even though we're not meeting in person regularly or virtually. Okay. On that note, students cited being too busy and having unpredictable schedules for why they can't do an optional class Zoom, which is totally fine. That's the whole reason why you signed up for an online asynchronous class, right? But please email me to schedule a one-on-one Zoom if you need help. If you can't make my office hours, that's okay. You can schedule another time to meet with me. For example, on Fridays, almost every Friday I work from home, and that's when I create these videos and I lesson plan and I grade. That's a great time to meet with me via Zoom. If you can't make my virtual office hours, but you are available during my in-person office hours, but you can't come to campus, we can schedule a Zoom during that time. I want to be as accessible to students as possible, so make sure you're coordinating with me as needed. I was pleasantly surprised that everyone is okay with the workload for our class so far. But again, if that changes and things become unmanageable, you can always let me know by responding to the exit pass or emailing me. And then as far as pet peeves, the most relatable for me was the fact that someone said people asking for help when they have not put in the effort to look for the answers themselves first, which I find very relatable at this point in the semester because I have done tutorials on how to find things and how to submit things several times at this point. So make sure if you get behind in our class, you go through all of the material from that week on our eLearn page, you watch the weekly lecture video, and then when you email me for help, ask specific questions. Say, I watched your week 6 video and I didn't understand this concept, or I still had some questions about the discussion post that's due for later that week. And then the most aspirational for me, someone said that they're in a stage of life where they don't really have any pet peeves anymore. What a wonderful place to be at in life. So I aspire to do that as well. All right, and without further ado, I am going to go to our eLearn page. I was just doing a video for my blended students, so I got to get out of that. Here's our page. Let me get into student view. All right, so if you go to content, and you go to important documents, here is our syllabus. If you ever have questions about how you're going to be assessed in this class, here are all the assignments. And then there's a little blurb for each assignment type. These quizzes are pretty self-explanatory. Basically, you get all the points for doing them. That's why they don't have like a study guide or something like that. There is a rubric for the discussion posts. The reading quizzes, again, if you're up to date with all the readings from the chapter, from the textbook, you should be in good shape. And literally the quiz will tell you what chapter the questions are from. But if you ever have questions about the reading quizzes, you can email me. And then the exams have study guides, which I always aim to post on our eLearn page about a week before the due date. As far as our course schedule, here is each week. I don't include dates for online classes because you really and truly are working at your own pace. And so if you go to week 3, which is the week we're currently in, research methods, you'll see the topic. For the most part, these topics align with chapters in our textbook, which should tell you what you should be reading. And then you see the assignments. So this week, chapter 2 quiz plus discussion 3. And that's due Sunday, September 14th at 11:59 p.m. So here are the due dates. For the most part, everything is due Sunday at 11:59 p.m. And you can even see what date that is. I don't think there's any exceptions. Now, you can work in advance, right? Like we're in week 3 and I just opened week 5 and 6 up. Well, you will not have access to the weekly PowerPoint and virtual lecture until right before that upcoming week. So like this is Thursday, week 2, and I'm making the lecture for week 3. Everything else you can work ahead on, including assignments like quizzes, discussions, and hopefully exams. I'm working on making sure the exams will open a little bit early. And once I do that in my week 4 video, I will provide details on that for you. But at a minimum, you know that you should be having assignments due for our class Sunday, 11:59 p.m. And then here is what our weeks look like. And so the instructor video and PowerPoints are in a separate little area. This is a drop down with everything that you need to be successful for that week. So it starts off with a checklist of everything you're supposed to be doing. And typically the assignments are toward the bottom. So you can see here, the discussion is here. And let's say you don't want to like you've already gone and clicked through all these things. You can always go straight to the assignment that's due, go to discussion. That's where that is. So you can post that. Let's look at week 3. Discussion, go to discussion. You can post that. Go to quiz. And there's a start quiz option here. Maybe. And then you go through, you answer all of you answer a question, you go to next page, and you keep going until you finish, and then you click submit quiz at the end. For details on how many opportunities you have per quiz, see the syllabus. And I think that pretty much covers that. I did just send out a class-wide email regarding discussion posts. So make sure you are paying attention to the rubric for the discussion posts and then also following along with that email that I sent out as far as sort of tips and tricks and pitfalls. So the tips and tricks are things you should be doing each time you do a discussion post. And the pitfalls are things that a lot of folks made mistakes on for the first discussion post. Make sure you're avoiding those pitfalls for all future discussion posts, because I do grade them based off of the rubric. And so I will start taking off points starting with the second discussion post. All right. So let's jump into a review. So, paradigms are philosophical and theoretical frameworks used within a discipline to formulate theories and generalizations. And then we test these paradigms and find support for them by doing experiments. And so, one of the reasons I wanted to review this term this week is because the experiments we perform to figure out, does this paradigm, does this theory hold true for a variety of social phenomena? That's essentially what research methods are. A hypothesis. Once a theory is developed, this is how we test the theory. Hypotheses can look different depending on the type of data collected. So there's sort of two main types of data, qualitative and quantitative. And depending on your research question and your hypothesis, that's going to influence the type of data you collect. Social solidarity are social ties within a group. This is another one of Durkheim's early contributions to the field, because one of his early studies was looking at the individual issue of suicide and how it impacts social ties and the broader social world. I bring this up as part of our review because how Durkheim collected data for that study still influences how folks collect data and do their research methodology for their projects to this day. And then finally, constructivism proposes that reality is what humans construct it to be, and we as members of a society generally agree upon most socially constructed norms. We talked quite a bit last week during week 2 about how social constructs can change over time and vary by region. I will not belabor that point. All right, digging into chapter 2. So we do follow the scientific method like folks in the natural sciences. This might be something you've heard of as early as junior high or high school, but essentially you ask a question, a research question, then you research existing sources. Typically, this requires you to find scholarly journal articles in the database on the topic that you're interested in researching. Then you formulate a hypothesis. Then you design and conduct a study to test that hypothesis. And then once you have conducted that study and you've collected your data, you analyze the data to draw conclusions, and you end by reporting your results. Typically in the social sciences, we report results by publishing scholarly journal articles or books. But if, for example, you are working on a social science research project that's grant funded through the state or the federal government, then you would be more likely to report your results to that granting agency. And so you typically fill out a report, and that looks a little bit different than folks who are publishing journal articles and books. But it's still this idea that you should report the results and your analysis so that other people can learn from what you did. All right. So we talked a little bit about qualitative and quantitative data last week, but just as a refresher, qualitative data is data that focuses on words. So I think the most common thing that comes to mind for most folks is interview data and analyzing the transcripts of that data. But you can also analyze things that's a little less conventional. So the example I gave was TV shows. I have a book chapter coming out for publication in the near future where I analyze the Showtime TV show, The L Word. And so it originally aired in the early 2000s, but then they did a reboot after about a decade hiatus in maybe around 2017, 2018. So I analyzed the way that that show portrays the LGBTQ plus community, comparing and contrasting that portrayal in the early 2000s compared to a more contemporary context. Again, they're all examples of qualitative research methodology. Quantitative data is focused on numbers. I think the most common thing that comes to mind here is survey data where researchers are doing a statistical analysis. If you think about government agencies, they're really good at quantitative stuff. They tend to collect large data sets. And that kind of brings us to primary versus secondary data. So primary data is original data that you as a researcher collect. Secondary data is data collected by someone else that you request access to, and then you analyze on your own to draw your own conclusions for publication purposes. So a lot of social scientists who do quantitative research, they'll request access to a government data set like the census or the FBI's Uniform Crime Report. And then they will download that data, they'll analyze it in a statistical software package, they will draw their own conclusions, and they will publish on that government data. So that is an example of secondary data. Survey is where you collect data from subjects who respond to a series of questions about behaviors and opinions, often in the form of a questionnaire. Typically, surveys use closed-ended questions, so things that don't take very long to answer, oftentimes multiple choice. And again, this often lends itself to a statistical analysis. Population are the people that are the focus of a study. For example, you could want a population of college athletes, of international students, or teenagers living with type 1 diabetes. Your population would be every single person who would be a part of that particular category of people. However, that can be really overwhelming. For example, if you want to collect survey data from every single person living in the United States, that would be so overwhelming to try and get every single person in our country to respond and then inputting all that data, analyzing all that data. It would be a huge time commitment. So oftentimes social scientists draw a sample. Most researchers choose to survey a small sector of the population or a sample. This is a manageable number of subjects who represent a larger population. Now, there are different techniques for sampling, but that you'll probably learn about in upper division social science classes, especially classes that focus primarily and pretty much exclusively on research methods. But for our purpose, it's most important for you to know what random sampling is, which is where every person in a population has the same chance of being chosen for the study. All right. Chapter 2, overview, qualitative data. So again, I mentioned earlier that interviews are sort of the most common thing people think about, which is a one-on-one conversation between the researcher and the subject, typically using open-ended questions. Now, there are different types of interviews, just like there's different things and different categories within quantitative research. But for our purposes, as long as you know how to define an interview, you should be in good shape for assignments. Field research refers to gathering primary data from a natural environment, often conducting participant observations, which is where you join people and you participate in a group's routine activities for the purpose of observing them within that context. Ethnography is where you're immersed in the natural setting of an entire social community to observe and experience their everyday life and culture. The idea being that if you fully immerse yourself in a particular group, in a particular culture, you'll be able to better understand them than if you just observe them from afar. And I would also say field research, participant observations, and ethnography are most popular in the field of anthropology, but all people in all different social science fields utilize these research methods. And then your textbook authors in this chapter, they actually drill down even further and they talk about institutional ethnography, which is one type of ethnography. I bring this up because it has a near and dear place in my heart, because I actually got to meet Dorothy Smith and attend a training that she did at a national conference. It was a while ago, almost a decade ago now. But basically, institutional ethnography is a feminist perspective or approach to ethnography where you focus on the experiences of women and other folks with historically marginalized identities, like the LGBTQ plus community and people of color. The reason being is that often these folks have been erased from history and from social science research. And so by focusing on their experiences through institutional ethnography, you're giving life and exposure and representation to those historically marginalized communities. Now, a good example of institutional ethnography that sort of draws on the essence of Dorothy Smith's work would be like if you want to understand what happens when someone attempts to get a restraining order against someone who's a perpetrator of domestic violence. Already we should know, okay, institutional ethnography would be a good form of research methods because if we're thinking about a feminist perspective, people who experience domestic violence are statistically more likely to be women. Okay. And then instead of, focusing on interviewing folks who have experienced domestic violence or who are trying to go through the process of filing a restraining order, the institutional ethnographer would document the entire process from the point where that person walks into a police station in an attempt to file a restraining order, the process of filling out that form, and then following that form all the way through until the person ends up with the restraining order on file. So this also helps with transparency. Oftentimes when we think about bureaucracy, in particular government bureaucracies, there's a lack of transparency as far as like, why did it take so long for this restraining order to go into effect? Or why did it take so long for me to get my license renewed at the DMV? Well, if we follow quite literally the paperwork, it allows us to better understand what those processes look like. And then finally, a case study is an in-depth analysis of a single event, situation, or individual. And this is something that I often do in my own research. Right. And then we'll end with ethical concerns. So value neutrality is a practice of remaining impartial without bias or judgment during a study and in publishing results. Now, I add this question, should we ever not be quote unquote neutral? In the natural sciences, there's this push to sort of be sterile and standardized. But I argue we as social beings have unique experiences based off of our identity categories, based off of things like our race, our class, and our gender. And so that gives us a unique expertise on, okay, going back to the example of filing a restraining order and experiencing domestic violence, because we know women are more likely to have that experience. If you're a woman researching that particular topic, you're an expert on what it means to be a woman. And so some people would say, oh, well, you can't be neutral as a woman researching domestic violence. But I would argue that actually, not only can you be neutral, you actually bring a unique set of expertise because of your identity. So I just like to draw attention to that on our chapter on research methods. And then finally, the American Sociological Association has a code of ethics. When we collect data and when we do research, we should maintain objectivity and integrity in our research. We should respect subjects' rights to privacy and dignity. We should protect subjects from personal harm. We should preserve confidentiality. We should seek informed consent, either verbally or written. We should acknowledge collaboration and assistance, and we should disclose sources of financial support. So going back to the example I gave of if you have grant funding from the state or federal government, if you were to go and then also publish a scholarly journal article from that same project, you would want to disclose that you had funding from the state government or the federal government or whatever the case might be. All right, research in real life. So I thought students would be most interested in my MA thesis on party schools and fighting on college campuses. So I will do that lecture. So it's called Doing Gender, Doing Fights, a qualitative exploration of gender and fighting at party schools. And I've adapted this for our purposes. Doing gender is a theory that we will learn more about during our chapter and unit on gender, but I will give you a brief overview of that theory in just a second. Similar to how I always have an agenda for my lectures, I always like to do an overview when I'm giving a talk and I'm presenting my research at a conference or in the classroom. So I'm going to start by going over key terms. I'll talk about the significance of the study. I'll go over the literature. So again, that's researching what other people have already done on this topic. It helps to contextualize your study. I'll go over my methods, my findings, and my conclusion. And I would say this is a pretty standard way of organizing how you present research. Key term. All right, so a fight is a physical attack with an unclear victim or perpetrator. When I first started this project, I kind of operated under the assumption that everyone would know what I meant by a fight. But I did a preliminary pilot study where I asked students about fights, and they thought that I was referring to verbal altercations. And so then that made me realize that whenever I was doing focus groups for the actual study, I needed to clearly define what I meant by a fight. A party school is this student regulated culture that exists on some college campuses where there's extreme drinking and risky behavior. This is actually pretty official. The Princeton Review, which creates a lot of test prep stuff, like if you want to study for the GRE or the MCAT because you want to go to grad school or med school when you graduate, you go to the store, you buy a study book, and it's probably written by the Princeton Review. So they actually have a set of criteria that they use to evaluate colleges across the country to determine the party schools, and they make an annual list. Some schools you may have heard of that are near us that often make this list are Ohio University and West Virginia University. And so, of course, when I was working on my MA thesis and doing this research study, I was at West Virginia University. And in fact, my mentor, my MA thesis advisor, was in the process of finalizing her book on party schools. However, there are other types of schools, as you all know. So there are commuter schools, community colleges, residential campuses where students live on campus, but they're not necessarily engaging so much in this party school stuff. And these concepts are not mutually exclusive. For example, Sinclair is a commuter school. Students don't really live on campus or even close enough to campus to walk that often. So it's a community college and it's a commuter school, right? Okay. And then one of the things I focused on in my data collection process is how people understand masculinity and femininity and how those things sort of operate for individuals who are living on college campuses. So masculinity refers to appropriate gender norms for boys and men, and femininity refers to appropriate gender norms for girls and women. Reputation was another thing I was interested in asking folks about. This is simply the socially constructed markers assigned to individuals. So social construct, that should sound familiar to you. And another thing I want to point out on this slide is like, most people talk about masculinity and femininity and use that term at least at some point in conversation. And we all sort of have a basic understanding of what these things mean. But when you're doing research for the social sciences, no matter how simple of a term something is, if you want to better understand it, if it's the focus of your research and your data collection, you need to define it when you're presenting your findings to an audience. And you probably also want to provide an overview of these terms to the people who participate in your research study. Okay. So I'm not going to show you these videos for the sake of time, but these are actually YouTube videos of physical fights on college campuses with a reputation of being a party school. And so if you are unfamiliar with what this type of thing looks like, you can watch those videos on your own time. And I should also say, one fight is between two girls and one fight is between two boys. Okay. So why is this important? Well, we're normalizing behavior. We're normalizing physical fights within this context of the party school as sort of just a normal part of going out. It's a normal part of the college experience. But despite this normalization process, some folks are expressing concern. So the student ran newspaper, they wrote an article about a high profile case where at least one of the people who engaged in this physical fight was hospitalized. And so they're worried about this, even if the majority of the students aren't. And according to survey data that my MA thesis advisor collected from this campus, there's a pretty good risk of injury. In fact, 41% of simple assaults result in injury. And so I wanted to understand if this is high risk, but it's also being normalized, like what's going on here? Why is this type of behavior persisting? And what is unique about party schools that allows this behavior to get normalized? The literature or understanding what other people in the field have already researched and published on the same topic. So there's a lot on party schools. We know that the media perpetuates this stereotype. Often if you think about how college is portrayed in movies and TV shows. Party schools is sort of the quintessential college experience if you think about a movie like Animal House, for example. Fighting is just one of many risky behaviors folks who research party schools look at. So they also look at um, binge drinking, recreational drug use, and sexual assault. But again, one of the things that sort of is consistent when studying these risky behaviors is that all of these behaviors are normalized within the context of party schools. And sometimes other types of college campuses will also normalize this risky behavior. But by and large, it really is even more pronounced at party schools. And then there's some research on fighting, but there isn't a whole lot on the fact that these fights are normalized and common on college campuses and in particular party schools. There is, however, a lot on fights and gender. And so we know that typically fights are going to occur between either two men or two women. And if there is a physical altercation between a man and a woman, it's probably going to be perceived as domestic violence, not a fight. Okay, in terms of theory, I mentioned doing gender. This is an idea that gender is in all social interactions, so we can't really escape it. We talked a little bit about this week one when we were discussing our introductions and the sociological imagination. It's this idea that food, we do gender to food. So I believe I gave the example of how I went out to eat a couple of weeks ago with a guy friend, and he ordered a watermelon salad and I ordered a cheeseburger. And when they went to deliver our food, the server crossed her hands and gave him the cheeseburger and me the watermelon salad, because in our society, we do gender to food where certain foods like cheeseburgers or steak is gendered in a masculine way. Men are supposed to order that type of food, and salads and seafood and chicken are sort of coded feminine, and women are supposed to want those types of food. So that's doing gender to food. But we can do gender to all different aspects of our social interactions, and fighting is no exception. Something is a social construct if it's socially agreed upon behavior, which you should already know that. And then there are two sociological ways of thinking about masculinity and femininity. So hegemonic masculinity is a socially agreed upon ideal way to perform masculinity. This is sort of the head honcho guy that other men try or ascribe to want to be like. Similarly, emphasized femininity is the socially agreed upon ideal way to perform femininity. So again, this is the sort of quote unquote queen bee that other women aspire to be like. Her hair and makeup's always perfect. She adheres to pretty traditional notions of femininity, and hegemonic masculinity is about adhering to pretty traditional notions of masculinity. All right, research methods. I did 3 focus groups at a large North Central university from December 2013 to February 2014, and each focus group lasted approximately 2 hours. As far as who I interviewed, I had 50% men, which is a little bit high because the overall population of men in that university is 54%. My sample of women was 43%, and the overall population at that school was 46%. And so you can see what sampling looks like in real life. I would hypothesize probably the reason why I had more men, a disproportional amount of men in my study compared to their overall population, is because fighting is coded as a masculine thing. So men would be more interested in participating in the research study when I recruited. The mean age is 19, but the overall mean age for the population is 21. I did recruit primarily in lower division intro classes, so that's probably one reason why my sample's a little lower than average. But also younger people maybe are a little bit more interested in this topic. And then as far as race, my sample was 79% white, 21% Black. The overall population was 83% white, 4% Black, and 13% other minorities. So again, this just shows you how you would want to present what you did, your research methods, and your participants and population and all that stuff to an audience when you're sharing your findings. You also, it's typical to provide sample questions if you did interviews or showing your audience the survey questions if you did a quantitative project. But I ask questions like, how common are fights like this between two men and women here at the university? Describe what happens with a typical male on male fight. And then I also ask, describe what happens with a typical female on female fight. What behaviors led up to this violence, and how does this participation contribute to a person's self-identity? All right, in terms of men and their physical fights on college campuses, in particular party schools, college men tend to fight to prove their masculinity, to perform appropriate masculine norms. But then the exception is that if they lose a fight or they show emotion, that's sort of going against the grain, and they're the exception to the rule there. So here's actual data from the focus groups. If you're known as a guy that wins fights, like my roommate's been in 5 or 6 fights now, he's won every one, and he's known as, in the frats, he's known as the super cool guy, and oh, he's a fighter and he's really big and tough. So essentially, getting into physical fights for men can be a way to sort of prove masculinity, especially if maybe you have not achieved hegemonic masculinity, but you're attempting to. And then here's another quote. Yeah, I think if you're connected to thinking you're a big, tough caveman, then yeah, fighting would have, like you said, it's connected to masculinity. You need to be manly. But I bet if you lose a fight, I bet that would really hurt emotionally. And that's not something we typically associate with men, right? And I want to also point out at this point in time that here is how I usually present an audience with qualitative data. I pull quotes from the transcripts, and then I tell you a little bit about that person, and I actually just type up the exact thing they said. So why do women fight? Well, even though getting into a physical altercation has not historically been something women are supposed to do, women did get into physical altercations on this college campus. However, they weren't able to just like jump into a fight. They had to have verbal insults exchanged beforehand, or they had to have prolonged tension with this woman, or they had to really explain and justify their participation in this physical altercation afterward. The exception being a woman who already self-identifies as being ratchet. All right, so a feminine trait is to be more passive. And I feel like a lot of female fights, they had been personally attacked verbally beforehand, such as, oh, she called me a bitch. Well, I can't have people thinking that it's okay for her to call me a bitch, or I need to do something about this. And then as far as like the sort of exception to the rule, the way I look at fighting with women is I just don't think it's very reputable. I just don't think it's a very classy thing. But I know some girls I know this one girl who will label herself as ratchet. That's part of her identity, and she's proud of it. She would be more proud to get in a fight than I would. So again, you can see my findings and then how I justify those findings based off of data, literal transcripts, quotes pulled from the data. And again, I tell you a little bit about who's saying that. In conclusion, so you always want to sort of summarize your findings. So often traditional notions of gender norms persist, but there are exceptions. And so this leads me to more questions, which is often the case when you collect data, you answer some questions, and then you come up with new ones. So I've always wondered, are there alternative forms of masculinity and femininity available to college students? That would make sense developmentally, right? Because college is supposed to be this time where you're learning about yourself as an adult for the first time, you're exploring new hobbies, new experiences. So perhaps the masculine and feminine norms are a little less rigid because of what we expect from college students. I've always wondered, are these findings unique to party schools? I think about Sinclair. If there was a physical fight on our campus, I don't think it would fly. I don't think it would be normalized. I think perhaps the cops would get called pretty quickly, and those students would get expelled, or they would have some serious consequences. But when this type of behavior is normalized, even if it happens on or near campus, students are let off with a warning. They're perceived as quote unquote kids just being kids by people in positions of authority. Ultimately, future research would be required at a variety of campuses, and I did not do that because I went on to do my PhD work, which was a very different project. And then finally, you always want to share with your audience the different works cited. So this is the literature review stuff. Other people who have done similar research, you always want to include that. And I always like to thank my audience. All right. So hopefully that gives you a sense of sort of what research can look like and how it's not as clean cut or simple as maybe you might think it is after reading the textbook chapter on research methods. Don't forget to do your exit pass. I hope you're seeing now how important that is in terms of me adapting our class and going over stuff with you in my weekly lectures. Make sure you're finishing chapter 3 and starting chapter 4. We're in week 3. Next week, week 4, you will be taking your first midterm exam, and that covers chapters 1, 2, 3, and 4, which is why I'm encouraging you to start reading chapter 4 this week, week 3. Chapter 2 quiz is due this week at 11:59 p.m. on Sunday. Discussion 3 on research methods and annotated bibliography is due this week, Sunday at 11:59 p.m. And within the next couple of days, I will post the study guide for midterm 1. So make sure you're taking notes for that and you're studying and you're preparing and you're asking me questions. Other than that, enjoy your week and I will talk to you all later. Bye, everyone.